welcome to Daily Debrief by People's Dispatch, your daily dose of news from around the globe. I'm Shreya and we go to France today where unions are protesting against a recent overhaul in the French pension system. Meanwhile, Indonesia's President Joko Widodo has officially admitted the mass killings and human rights violations committed in his country in the past. We also take a look at the 15th edition of Men's Hockey World Cup, which begins on 13 January in the Indian state of Odisha. In France, the Emmanuel Macron-led government has announced reforms to the pension system. One of these includes increasing the retirement age by 2 years, making it 64. Unions have announced a series of protests and strikes to begin from January 19, calling the reforms unfair and unnecessary at a time when France is facing a cost of living crisis. We're joined by Abdul from People's Dispatch, who has the details on this issue. Thank you for joining us, Abdul. Can you tell us why the Macron government has introduced these reforms and also take us through some of these reforms and what they include?
Well, it has been a long-term agenda of Macron ever since he got elected for the first time in 2017. He had announced that the expenditure on pensions and on government public servants is quite high. As per the data published, there is a claim that around 40% of French budget goes on pensions. So it is a huge amount for them. And therefore, he wanted to kind of reduce that particular expenditure. And one of the ways Macron has suggested and Macron's administration has suggested is to increase the age of retirement from 60 to 64 years. So on that basis, he wanted to introduce this so-called reforms in 2020 for the first time. Of course, it led to heavy popular reaction, very strong popular reactions, which ultimately, and after that, there was COVID outbreak and so on and so forth. So the so-called reforms were delayed. During the elections, which happened last year, Macron also campaigned on the similar lines, that once he wins, he will implement these, what he considers are reforms. Given the fact that there is a long-term austerity measures which is adopted by the French state, and most of the European states have moved out from what was considered as a golden age of capitalism in 70s and before 70s and 80s. This is one aspect which has remained untouched in France, in the French administration, and therefore Macron wanted to his administration sees it as one of the basic reasons for whatever financial problems France is facing. So with this objective in mind, when he contested the elections in 2000 last year, basically, he campaigned on these grounds. Though the mandate was not very clear, despite the fact that he won in the second round, the mandate was not yet clear. But and in the parliament also, he does not have majority now, but still he has introduced these reforms according to the details which are there in the public domain. The increase in the retirement age will not happen at once. It will be in a staggered form, in a gradual system, with 3 months increasing every year, and ultimately by 2030, the age of retirement will become 64. Macron wanted to make it 65, but it seems because he has no majority in the French parliament, there was a compromise deal with the Republican Party, which basically led to the reduction of 1 year. So that is a compromise. Otherwise, Macron's original plan was to increase the age to 65 years.
Right, Abdul. And a little bit also about what are some of the reactions right now to these reforms, the immediate reactions?
Well, the French trade unions, at least, are completely opposed to it. There is already an announcement of a strike on 19th, and there will be many more actions, of course. Most of the trade unions from left to right are opposed to it. The left party in the French parliament has, of course, is opposed to the this so-called reform. In fact, during the elections last year, they had contested on kind of uh, keeping the age of retirement as it is, and the popular mandate they got, the votes they got, was a reflection of the popular mood against such kind of changes. There are surveys which indicate that majority of the French people are also opposed to these reforms. The public servants is a huge constituency across France, and it has this age of retirement is considered 60 years is considered quite high, in fact, in the popular domain. And if over and above we want to increase it to 64 and 65, of course, people are not going to like it. So as there were oppositions in last year, sorry, in when it was first introduced in 2019-20, I think similar kind of protests are going. France is going to see in coming days. Um, this particular reform coming amidst the so-called cost of living crisis also makes it much more problematic for the common people that the pensions, uh, it is not only about increasing the age of retirement, it is also about there is a plan to reduce the overall pension, the money which goes to the pension fund. It means the large constituency which relies on pension as a source of income in the difficult times will not like it, and this will further complicate. France is already facing a lot of popular protests, as I mentioned before, on the cost of living, related to the cost of living crisis, rising prices of basic commodities, food, and so on and so forth, energy and all. And over and above, now this increase of the retirement further complicates the matter for the common people. And I think the reactions given by the trade unions, given by the major political forces, which have presence both in parliament and in other places, shows that popular mood is against this particular reform.
Thank you so much for joining us, Abdul. Indonesian President Joko Widodo has officially admitted the gross human rights violations that took place during 12 events in the country's recent history. The government's acknowledgement comes on the basis of a report from non-judicial settlement team for serious human rights violations. Around 500,000 people died and 1 million were jailed in 1965 when the Indonesian military began purging communists, accusing them of planning a coup. Acknowledging the mass killings, Widodo has said that the government will try to restore the rights of victims fairly and wisely. We're joined by Anish from People's Dispatch with the latest updates on this issue. Can you tell us a little bit about this? What is the latest there in Indonesia, and a little bit also about the backstory of this development?
Yes, so this began with the latest is basically that the president not just accepted the commission's report on the 12 incidents, which were of what they call at least the 12 incidents of serious human rights violations, and have accepted that the crimes did happen and that they need to be that there needs to be a repression system outside of the judicial cases, and also called for investigation. Now, the thing is that this is happening pretty much at the fag end of Joko Widodo's presidency. He had promised this in 2014 when he first became president. And it has taken almost 9 years now to actually come to a point where this investigation actually went to a serious point. That aside, it's quite significant in the sense that this is probably the first time that the highest official of Indonesia has actually admitted to the anti-communist massacre that happened in 1965, 1966, after a failed coup, which was blamed on the Communist Party at the time, which was, as we know, was the largest in Asia, and probably had about more than 1 million members in the 1960s, had significant power within the government, and it was the sort of right-wing and a militaristic reaction to the communist hold in power that actually led to that sort of not only the fall of Sukarno, but also the massacre that happened, which estimates say killed between 500,000 to close to 2 million people. And this is probably one of the most underreported massacres in modern history right now. And so this admission is pretty much the fact that it is a good step in a way that this is the first time that there is such an admission, obviously. But it happening about like 6 decades after it, or nearly 6 decades after the whole incident happened. We are not sure how things would, progress from here. There are also other instances of many of these violations. We need to remember happened during the Suharto administration, the dictatorship of President Suharto, and the military, regime that was in place. Essentially, disappearances of student activists, many of them underage. Killing of minorities, killing of any kind of political movement that actually even remotely challenged the administration at the time. So all of that, but there are also incidents of post democratization crimes that did happen, especially two incidents from West Papua that is also significant. The That happened between 2003 and 2004, and much of that happened in riots that actually took place. But there were significant involvement of state actors in these incidents as well. So in all of these, the admission is a first step that has happened. Need to wait and see how things progress from here.
Right, Anish, and President Jokowi's admission of the mass crimes has had equal criticism as well as support in equal measures. So, how do we see these reactions?
Well, it is interesting that the way in which the whole thing happened has had detractors from the beginning, and specifically, and obviously, there have always been right-wing detractors to such a move of not only facing the past crimes, but also talking about reparations and so on. But there were progressive and human rights activists who actually uh, criticized the move from the outset when it was first announced in 2014, because people were not sure how it will take shape, what kind of commission. The commission's constitution itself was quite controversial at the time, because and also its mandate, because let's begin with the fact that the mandate is only to ascertain whether or not these crimes happen. It did not really deal with other things. So all of these factors definitely does affect. We have to look at some of the key criticisms. The most important one being the fact that there is no mention of the actors involved in these incidents, in all of these 12 incidents. And that is a problematic. That is problematic primarily because, and especially because the government is looking for an out-of-court settlement for victims. And while President Jokowi has talked about, prosecution of these crimes, to the Attorney General, even though the Attorney General's office has in the past declined to go ahead with any investigation on these matters. The fact that the government is looking for and preferring out of court settlement shows that they do not want fingers to be raised to any of the powerful people involved in the incident. There were parties, there were right wing groups that were clearly involved in, for instance, in the anti-communist purge, that still operate legally in Indonesia and have had a very problematic history, in that they not only deny their involvement, they deny that the massacre even happened in the first place, even though there are people within the organization who continues to boast about their involvement in killing communists at the time.
Thank you so much for joining us on this issue, Anish. The International Hockey Federation's World Cup for Men gets underway in the East Indian state of Odisha on January 13. It is the second consecutive time India, specifically Odisha, is hosting the tournament, which raises several questions, some with obvious answers, others not so much. Once dominated by teams from South Asia over the past several decades, men's field hockey has become a sport for the West, Europe and Australia in particular. Pakistan was the last Asian nation to win the event back in 1994. Siddhant Annie joins us to attempt some of the obvious questions. Hi Siddhant. So this is the second time that India will be hosting the Men's Hockey Cup. How has that come about? This is something not very often seen in, how as tournaments go. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Firstly, though, we barely recovered from the hangover of the Football World Cup that just finished in Qatar.
Right.
So having this so soon, of course, we knew it was coming. It still seems like what's happening. It's like flashback a little bit. It's a good question, Shreya, because actually the space for hockey to exist in today's sort of commercial environment in which sport operates has shrunk tremendously. Hosting a World Cup, for example, there is an expectation that the state of Odisha will spend over 1,000 crore on hosting this tournament. That's what is it in US dollars? I'm not exactly sure, but it's a substantial amount of money, and not too many countries, governments, local administrations, city-wise, are at this point keen to spend that kind of money on a sporting event that doesn't necessarily bring in the eyeballs or the revenue from television rights or sponsorship deals that you would expect from this kind of tournament. So India has, in many ways, over the past few years, because of our legacy in hockey, in field hockey, and wanting to sort of reclaim some of that lost history, has become kind of a savior for world hockey by hosting major tournaments for both men and women consistently across age group levels. Unfortunately, the irony or the dichotomy of it is that at the same time, local level tournaments and participation in hockey on the ground, because the sport has become progressively more expensive to play in India, has reduced massively. Right today, to play a sport which once could be played on it can still be played on any surface, but if you want to reach an elite level, because of how the Europeans have kind of changed the sport of field hockey since the 50s and the 60s, introducing artificial surfaces. You have now extremely expensive equipment. The game has become so fast that you need to buy protective equipment alone. For example, a goalkeeper's kit can cost anywhere up to 100,000, 150,000 rupees. So on the one hand, you see this sort of looking back at the legacy and the role that, let's say, India's tribal populations, particularly from Odisha, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, these parts have played in Indian hockey story. And a situation today where it's so expensive that the same people cannot participate in the sport unless there's some kind of handout given, right? Unless some kind of grassroots tournament is organized in the build-up to a World Cup. You don't need to have a World Cup to have those grassroots tournaments. You can spend that 1,000 crores, creating grounds or giving out. If you are so keen to involve the local population in the sport, right, then you could do it directly without having a mega tournament. But of course, India's politics also come into play, because this is a state that is not governed by the BJP. And it's a welcome change to see a different sport happening and getting some kind of showpiece event in India at a stadium that is named after Birsa Munda, not, for example, Narendra Modi, who is the current Prime Minister. So at least symbolically, there are some positives, but it's a difficult one to justify really at that level, why back-to-back tournaments are going to the Indian taxpayer, and how Odisha is actually funding all of this.
Right, and I think you mentioned this while addressing the previous question and even in the discussions we were having prior to this. So in terms of participation, hockey is seeing increased participation, but how does this sport hold any kind of relevance for the wider audience? as you mentioned, there is some sort of waning interest in it largely.
Yeah, so we'll go back to that bit about Europeans changing the sport, right? To make it actually, what happened essentially was, I guess, they didn't like the idea of these brown folk from India and Pakistan just winning all the gold medals at all the Olympic Games, just forever and ever. And so slowly surface changed, the offside rule changed, the wrong side rule changed. A lot of these small but very important changes came into the game that made it a lot more like football, uh, and a lot more geared to a television audience, because I think it was assumed that that would be the anyway overall more geared to a European audience. But when you say participation has increased, participation is massive in European countries like the Netherlands, for example, where a massive chunk of all adults are members of hockey clubs right now. But the Netherlands is a relatively rich country. They have those stadiums, localities have clubs where people can go and play recreationally and become members and enjoy the sport. And that's why some of these countries have progressively gotten so much better at the sport. But because it's become so expensive to play, and it's so similar to football, which is an extremely cheap sport to play, right? You go to a village, you have 100 kids there. All you need is one football to play 10 games, right?
Right.
You can engage all 100 kids. If you go to play hockey, you need multiple balls. You need at least a dozen or so sticks. You need protective equipment. You need all kinds of other gear to be able to actually play the sport in any sort of meaningful manner. So why would a wider audience be interested in a sport that is like football when they already have football, right? So it's kind of problematic. And because I think it's an interesting time, and I'm hoping that during the course of this World Cup, I'll get a chance to speak to some of the senior leadership of the International Hockey Federation and get their views on this subject. But it's a good time for India to kind of start, because they are dominating how the sport is run in terms of these commercial aspects. No one else is putting money into it. It's time maybe to start putting pressure to go back, revising some of those changes, slowing the sport down, therefore reducing the chances of serious injury, and therefore reducing the amount of equipment required, and therefore making it more accessible to people. Because the only way hockey will have a wider audience is if people get a chance to play it, enjoy it, and feel like they connect with that sport. Not that they are watching some substitute for a football game just because it's on, So yeah, that's basically the story.
Thank you so much, Siddhant, for your insights. And that's all we have for today. For more such stories and updates from around the globe, follow us on peoplesdispatch.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.